From today, we will study the theory of international politics. Domestic politics are connected to international politics. So let's first look at realist theory. Realism is a prominent theoretical framework. In the study of international relations, it emphasizes a pragmatic approach to politics, centered around the concepts of power and national interests. Realism argues that the international system is anarchic, meaning there is no overarching authority above states, leading them to act primarily in their own self-interest to ensure their survival and maintain their sovereignty. Here are key principles and concepts associated with realism. In international politics, states use states as the primary in international politics. They focus on the actions and interactions of states, rather than non-state actors or international organizations. In the realm of international relations, the realist perspective posits that states are the central figures in global politics. This approach, known as state-centric realism, argues that the most important and influential actors on the international stage are sovereign states. According to realists, the behavior of these states and the interactions between them shape the international system, influence global stability, and drive the dynamics of international relations. From a realist viewpoint, the primary motivation for state actions is national interests, which is often defined in terms of power and security. Realists maintain that because the international system is anarchic, lacking a central authority, states must rely on their own capabilities to secure their survival and achieve their objectives. This leads to a self-help system where states prioritize their own security and interests, often through power accumulation and strategic alliances. Realism tends to marginalize the roles of non-state actors such as multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations (NGOs), and international organizations, like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. While realists do not deny the existence or influence of these entities, they argue that these actors operate within the limits and under the influence of the state-centric system. For realists, even when non-state actors seem to wield significant influence, their power is contingent upon the states that grant them authority or allow them operational leeway. This state-centric approach has significant implications for how international politics is analyzed and understood. It leads to a focus on diplomatic relations, military engagements, and treaties between states as the main drivers of international affairs. Realists view international organizations and norms as reflective of the power distributions and interests of the dominant states, rather than as independent forces shaping state behavior. Moreover, realism emphasizes that international cooperation is often a result of converging state interests rather than altruistic motives. Agreements and alliances are seen as temporary alignments of interests, where states cooperate as long as it serves their individual strategic goals. This perspective explains why alliances can shift and agreements can be renegotiated as the balance of power or national interests change. In sum, the state-centric approach of realism provides a framework for understanding international relations that prioritizes state behavior and interstate dynamics over other factors. It offers a pragmatic lens through which the complexities of global politics can be analyzed, focusing on power, security, and national interests as the key determinants of state behavior in an anarchic international environment. This approach remains influential in both academic analysis and practical policymaking, guiding the decisions of state leaders and the strategies of diplomats around the world. 2. Anarchy. The international system is considered anarchic, as there is no global government to enforce rules or norms. This anarchy compels states to rely on their own capabilities to secure their interests and survival. In international relations, the concept of anarchy is fundamental to the realist theory, particularly influencing how states perceive their interactions and strategies on the global stage. Anarchy in this context does not imply chaos or disorder, but rather the absence of a central governing authority that can enforce rules and norms universally. This characteristic of the international system shapes the behavior of states profoundly. 8. Definition and implications. Anarchy in international politics means that each state operates in a system where there is no higher authority than itself. The lack of a global government results in a self-help system where states must depend on their own resources and capabilities to ensure their security and pursue their interests. Without a supranational authority to provide security or mediate conflicts, states exist in a constant state of potential conflict with one another, as each seeks to ensure its survival and maximize its power. B. Self-help system. The concept of a self-help system is central to understanding anarchy in international relations. In such a system, states prioritize their security because there can be no assurance that other states will not use their power to threaten their existence. This leads to strategies such as power balancing, where states align with others to counteract a potentially dominant power, or power maximization, where states seek to amass as much power as possible to deter threats. Sheet conclusion. The realist concept of anarchy in international relations provides a framework for understanding why states act the way they do in the absence of a global authority. It highlights the challenges states face in securing their interests and survival in a system where they must rely primarily on themselves. Despite its limitations and the emergence of theories that offer more cooperative views of international relations, the concept of anarchy remains a fundamental part of the study of global politics, reflecting the complex and often competitive nature of state interactions. 3. Power politics. Power is a central concept in realism. States seek to accumulate power to protect themselves and influence others. This can manifest as military buildup, forming alliances, or demonstrating economic dominance. In the framework of realism in international relations, the concept of power politics is central. Power is viewed as the ultimate currency that states use to secure their position and advance their interests in a global arena, characterized by anarchy and competition. This pursuit of power is driven by the fundamental belief that power equates to security and the ability to influence and shape the international order. A. Definition of power. Power in international politics can be defined in several ways, but it primarily relates to the capacity of a state to influence other states and achieve its foreign policy objectives. This influence can be military, economic, diplomatic, or cultural. Power is often measured in terms of relative capabilities including economic size, military strength, technological advancement, and political stability. B. Accumulation of power. States engage in power politics by accumulating resources that enhance their strategic positions. This accumulation can take various forms. Military buildup, one of the most direct manifestations of power. Politics is the enhancement of military capabilities. This can include increasing the size of the military, modernizing weaponry, and developing strategic technologies such as nuclear arms. A strong military not only deters potential adversaries, but also gives a state leverage in international negotiations. Forming alliances are a key aspect of power politics, where states cooperate with one another to enhance their security and counterbalance potential threats. Alliances can provide mutual defense and strategic advantages, thereby amplifying the power of individual states through collective strength. Economic dominance demonstrating economic power is another critical aspect of power politics. Economic strength allows a state to exert influence through trade, investment, and financial aid. Economically powerful states can impose economic sanctions, negotiate favorable trade agreements, and use their market size as a diplomatic tool. 4. National interest realists believe that states act in pursuit of their national interests, which are often defined in terms of power. Policies are judged not by moral imperatives, but by how effectively they secure these interests. 8. In the realm of realism in international relations, the concept of national interest is paramount. Realists argue that states act primarily in pursuit of their national interests, which are broadly defined in terms of power and security. This perspective holds that states, as rational actors, make decisions based on a clear assessment of what will best serve their strategic objectives, rather than moral considerations or global welfare. Definition and scope of national interests. National interest encompasses the goals and objectives that a state seeks to achieve to maintain and enhance its power, security, and welfare. This can include territorial integrity, economic prosperity, and political stability. Realists emphasize that the national interest is not a fixed entity, but can evolve with changing geopolitical dynamics and internal political considerations. 5. Security dilemma in an anarchic international system. Actions taken by one state to increase its security can lead to reactions from other states, which might perceive these actions as threats to their own security. This can create a cycle of tension and competition.
Leaders and scholars think about international relations using different perspectives. A perspective is a particular attitude towards how international relations works and how actors should react that emphasizes certain facts over others. The oldest international relations perspective is called realism, or the realist perspective. This mini lecture will introduce the major concepts to define this perspective. One way to distinguish between perspectives is to ask yourself the question, is war between nations inevitable? Recorded history is full of efforts by those who answer the question in the negative, to create international rules that make life more stable and predictable by decreasing the outbreak of violent aggression between nations. So far, these efforts have failed, including the Peace or Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 that marks the beginning of the modern international system, the Concert of Europe in the 19th century, the League of Nations, and our current United Nations. If you believe the failure of these efforts was inevitable, you might be a realist. The realist perspective sees the world largely in terms of an inevitable struggle for power and survival between unequal states. To understand and apply this perspective to first describe, explain, and predict international events, and secondly, to prescribe how international actors should behave, requires mastering 10 basic concepts. You may wish to pause the video to write these 10 concepts down. You will find more detailed definitions of them in your textbook or online. The historical failure of grand peace projects makes it relatively easy to understand why the first broad perspective on international relations was a little pessimistic about the long-term prospects for peace. The first realists made 3 observations or assumptions about how the international system worked. First, no central authority stood above the state. This is a condition known as anarchy. Realists assume that this condition is permanent. Now, anarchy is such an important concept, I want to step aside for the moment to define it. Anarchy is a system operating in the absence of any central government. It does not mean chaos, but the absence of political authority. Internally, states have solved the problem of order and established security by establishing their sovereignty, or their ability to control their territory, to enforce the rules and laws on people who might violate them. Externally, however, there is no one to guarantee this sovereignty, and that means that in international relations, those relations are happening in an anarchical world. The second assumption that states make about the international system, assuming again that it's permanently anarchical, is that states cannot assume that other states are going to help them survive, and they thus must rely upon the idea of self-help, which is simply meaning taking responsibility for your own survival, acquiring the means and ability to ensure that happens. This leads to the third assumption or observation about international relations from the realist perspective, which is that self-help requires that states have more power, which we're defining as the means available for a state to secure its interests, including survival, relative to other actors. A state's primary responsibility is to create, maintain, and increase its national power at all costs, because if it cannot do this, it will not ultimately survive. This though, is problematic. The logical conclusion of each of these three assumptions is the inevitability of conflict due to something known as the security dilemma. As multiple states pursue relative power to each other, they constantly get into a situation where they're losing power relative to other actors. Right? So as states acquire more power to defend themselves due to self-help, they also become a greater threat to others. This traps states essentially in an arms race that inevitably leads to conflict. I'll demonstrate this in the next 3 slides. Assume a world in which there is a single 3 states, state A, state B, and state C. State A, having one unit of power, is a threat to state B and state C. This in turn will lead state B and state C to acquire a unit of power to make themselves equal to state A. But now state A will feel vulnerable because state B and state C together may be a threat to their survival. In turn, state A will increase its power in order to maintain that relative advantage to ensure its survival. But now state B and state C feel threatened by state A, and they in turn will increase their power. This cycle will continue inevitably until it is broken by some sort of conflict. Now, realists believe the security dilemma is permanent, is just as permanent as anarchy. But they do recognize that its worst effects, like total war, World War I, World War II, can be delayed. In other words, anarchy and the security dilemma do not mean constant war, just the inevitability of one in the future. Since war threatens survival of a state, realists seek ways to try to delay the start of the next conflict or to reduce its scope and severity. Now, realists disagree about the best way of doing that. What's the best approach to moderating the excesses of the excesses of the security dilemma? The two strategies that they employ are known as the balance of power or hegemony. Both of these approaches are useful. The first balance of power assumes that states will seek only enough power to defend themselves against others. Thus, there will be a slow sort of process of the sort of erosion of balance between the actors. A second strategy, hegemony, assumes that states will seek enough power until they have the majority of power in their region or even globally. Thus assuring that they will be able to dominate without the ability of the other states to respond. Again, as I said before, realists disagree about which of these strategies is better at moderating the excesses of the security dilemma. The debate between balance of power realists and power transition realists is ultimately about polarity, or the structure or distribution of power between states. In a unipolar world, a single actor has enough power to dominate as the hegemony. In a balance of power world, which may be either bipolar or multipolar, there is a rough balance between the great powers, just determined by the number of them. Bipolarity is like the Cold War, where you have two great superpowers. Multipolarity is more the norm, where you have many powers who have roughly the same amount of power. States have several different strategies that they can pursue in order to enhance their chances of survival in anarchy and to affect the polarity of the international system. 4 of the most common strategies form a sort of menu of choices from which states can choose how to respond. The first is known as balancing. This is a classic realist strategy for states, especially for powerful states. In this strategy, states work to maintain the balance of power by forming temporary alliances to ensure that no single state gets too powerful. For example, in the 19th century, Great Britain was the decisive influence in maintaining and restoring the balance of power between European rivals by constantly supporting weaker nations threatened by Britain's larger great power rivalries. For example, supporting Turkey in its war against Russia, or supporting France in a war against Spain, supporting parts of Italy against wars against the Austro-Hungarians. An alternative strategy is called buck passing. States that adopt this strategy still want to maintain the relative balance of power between states, but they want to avoid the cost associated with the act of balancing. So in this case, states can take the risk that another state will pay the cost of balancing. For example, during the Cold War, the United States paid a large share of the cost of defending Europe from the Soviet Union than the Western European states themselves. which then in turn help them to fund a more generous social welfare program for their citizens. So you have a trade-off, right? The assumption was the United States will pay the cost of defending Europe against the Soviets, which in turn allowed Western Europe to buck pass a little bit. Another alternative to balancing is known as bandwagoning, which is when a state aligns with a greater power to either share the spoils of dominance or to avoid the costs of opposition. For example, in World War II, Italy joined forces with Germany and Japan as a way of sharing the spoils of war. They wanted to expand and have an empire, and they felt that the assistance of the Germans and, to a lesser extent, the Japanese would make this possible. Thus, they bandwagoned with Germany. In the same conflict, after Germany destroyed Poland, Romania and Bulgaria sided with Germany as a way of avoiding the costs of being occupied. Such as, well, we're next, unless we say, hey, Germany will help you out in this conflict. Either though the motivation was different, all those cases would be considered examples of bandwagoning. The final strategy, hiding, is only available to a small number of states. Again, small states. States can try, if they're small enough, to stay smaller, to stay so small, the powerful states either ignore or forget them. States that are hiding often declare themselves as being neutral. But neutrality can also just simply be a form of buck passing. Well, we're going to stay out of this conflict. We're neutral. When they really do have a preferred outcome, they simply don't want to pay the costs, and they're not sure who's going to lose. However, states like Switzerland or even smaller principalities like Liechtenstein or Monaco in Europe have all tended to tenderly stay out of conflict for very long periods of time, simply by just keeping their head low and staying out of the politics that was affecting conflict around the country, around the continent.
Hello everybody, welcome to our Something Political video. In this video, we will talk about our first international relations theory, realism. So, realism is mainly concerned with issues and questions like power, order and stability, how to establish peace, or how to prevent war. Because for realists, this is how the things work in world politics. They try to understand and explain this reality. That is why the theory is called realism. There are different subschools of realism, but in this video we will talk about the classical one. Classical realism is represented by Hans Morgenthau and Edward Hallett Carr. We will talk about them in another video. So, for classical realists, human nature is the principal reason why the world has wars and conflicts. Human beings are selfish creatures and they always try to maximize their own interests. That creates a constant struggle for power in the international system. For realists, state is the principal actor in causing or preventing violence in the international political system. The decision makers in states are always assumed to be rational actors. Be it states, individuals, or national leaders, they all act to maximize their power, which is a rational decision to make in realism's anarchical world. Oh, did we forget to mention anarchy? Well, not that one, but okay, hold on. Realism's world is anarchic because there is no central authority above states, which is the principal and seems like the most important actor, powerful enough to force rules or regulations on them. And that is why states have to rely on their own resources to protect themselves in an anarchical environment where nobody else will come to the rescue. That is why realists think that the power and security are two most important issues for states. Realists also think that since they can never be sure about the real intentions of their, let's say, neighbors, it would not be very possible to form alliances. They do not oppose to the idea of forming alliances, but they think that alliances and treaties last as long as they're useful, because every state will try to maximize its own national interest in the end. Lastly, we can say that in general, classical realism tries to come up with a theory of foreign policy. It tries to understand the foreign policy behaviors of other states. So that brings us to the very end of this very short video about classical realism. We will continue with the other sub-schools of realism and then with the other IR theories. If you liked the video, please do not forget to like it. And for our other videos, please subscribe to our channel.